Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum. In this modern era that we're living in right now, a lot of what we do as tradition and practice, as a way of life as Israel, a lot of it is often put aside, sometimes even completely gotten rid of. We find it being dismissed as mere traditions of the past, sometimes even called painful reminders of life under oppressive law and harsh conditions. I've heard that before. Sometimes it's even regarded as a waste of time, just a total waste of our limited time here on earth. While admittedly, within all walks of life, including our own, there are certain traditions that do need to be addressed, that do need to be studied and analyzed and maybe even left behind. Because as society, we naturally progress in our mannerisms, our practices, and the way that we treat each other, the way that we view how society should work, how economy works, how politics should work, how international relations should work. We progress naturally. It's a natural order of things, and that includes us as human beings. We're going to progress as well in the way that we think, in the way that we carry ourselves, in our behaviors and everything else. There are, however, though, despite all of that, there are certain concepts and traditions that we simply cannot leave behind, that we can't just get rid of. Rather, we have to understand it within, first, its historical context. Put it back into its historical context, not just a literal interpretation of a random passage on a page. We put it into its historical context. Then we understand it within its modern context. We take it from the historical and put it into the modern. Then that leads us to an explanation of why it still matters, why it's still applicable today. Now, within this area, the subject of modesty and dress code takes up a great portion of the discussion. Anytime you get into this talk about, well, what do we leave behind, what do we carry on, what was a tradition that developed strictly for that period of time, what is applicable today, anytime you get into really any of that kind of talk, the subject of modesty, the way that we dress, the way that we carry ourselves within society, that takes up a great deal of the discussion and often ends on very bad terms. And it ends that way due to ignorance of history, dishonesty about our ways of life, emotional rhetoric, personal grievances, whatever the case may be. These factors play heavily into this discussion, and it often leads to discussion ending with us agreeing to disagree, but on very negative terms. And that's not the way it should be. We should be able to end these kind of discussions, even if we don't agree with each other, on a common ground, on positive vibrations, so that we can preserve our brotherhood, our sisterhood, our nationhood as Israel. Now, recently, I myself was caught once again in a discussion regarding this very issue, and by the end of the conversation, it was one of the few times in my life where I was actually offended by what a person had to say about my religious beliefs and my practices. And I'm really never offended by what anybody says about what I do, about my religious stances, my political stances. It really doesn't faze me what a person has to say. But just the way that the person was coming at me, the intensity of their tone and just what they had to say, it was just, the whole deal made it it hit me hard. And it really bothered me the way that the person was coming at me, so I was a little offended. But the person who I have been speaking to referred to the stricter practices of modesty, the idea of a dress code in order to ensure that modesty. They considered it something barbaric, oppressive, isolationist, that it isolated you from the rest of society, that it was culturally backward. They said just about everything negative one could say about the subject. The one troubling thing, however, was not any of this, none of this rhetoric, but rather it was the individual's final point in the discussion that really bothered me. Their final point was that this practice of stricter forms of modesty, the idea of adhering to a certain dress code, that this was something that had nothing to do with the religious practices within Judaism, that it had no basis within the law, within the Halakha. This was troubling because it wasn't the first time that I had heard it. I heard it plenty of times before. In fact, I came to think at one point that there was some kind of consensus among many Jews that anything that they consider Middle Eastern in practice was regarded as just mere cultural tradition that had no place within modern Judaism, or Judaism within modern society. I don't like that term, modern Judaism. They dismiss the practice of women covering their hair or even their neck or even their face as just mere Middle Eastern cultural tradition, something that developed within the context of that culture, had no basis within Judaism, no basis within the law, and so it's not applicable today, and that we should not be doing it. Not that they just don't agree with it, but rather they just don't, that we should just not be doing it. Anyone doing it is wrong, and that they should not be doing it. It's that kind of mentality that's the problem here. Not so much that a person disagrees with the tradition, but that they really believe that any Jew should not be doing it. And the problem with it is because this is anything farther from the truth. To say that this has no basis within Judaism is so far from the truth. And to believe that we should simply dismiss a tradition, get rid of a practice because it developed within the context of a cultural atmosphere, that contradicts Judaism itself. In fact, if we were to go by that standard, we would have to get rid of a majority of our tradition, a majority of our practices. And that goes for any religion, really. It's the belief in the one and only God that is for certain. Everything else that we know and we do today, we know to have been developed within the context, within the cultural interpretation of sacred scriptures. This includes Judaism, whose traditions develop within the context of Hebrew Israelite culture. Now, when I say Hebrew Israelite, what do I mean by that? Because many people have a predisposition of what we mean when we say Hebrew Israelite due to some organizations, some groups nowadays who have racist tendencies, and people kind of put them up and they kind of hijack that term. But what we mean when I say Hebrew Israelite, when I say Israel, I'm talking about the nation of the covenant, those who have chosen to live by the Torah, all of its commandments, who are living that lifestyle, who are living as Jews, who are part of the covenant, who are part of Israel, that ancient nation. Even when we don't have a state, or when we didn't have a state, we were still Israel. That's what we mean when we say Israel. And that doesn't mean just Hebrews, because when I say Hebrew, I mean specifically what was for a long time the majority of the population within Israel. The Hebrews made up a majority of the population of Israel for a very long time. So the traditions that develop within that culture develop predominantly from the perspective of Hebrew people. So it developed within a Hebrew Israelite context. But Israel in and of itself is not strictly Hebrew. I think many of you understand what I mean by that. If you don't, feel free to ask me in a comment or message me in order to further clarify. So even when these culturally Hebrew Israelite traditions that became the law of Judaism, when these traditions spread with the belief in the one and only God Hashem to the European continent, we found that these Middle Eastern traditions had taken on a more European form. They retained the same meaning, the understanding and effect. If you go to Russia, Poland, Germany, even Ethiopia, Yemen, Jerusalem, Baghdad, Persia, anywhere, and you look at these traditions, you'll be able to recognize them. You'll know what their meaning is, their understanding is, the effect that they have on ourselves. But you'll also, at the same time, you'll realize how unique